Trust is a fragile thing. The day you realize it's been broken, something inside you changes forever. I knew at the moment Maggie walked through the door that night, smelling like cigarette smoke and cheap cologne. She barely glanced at me, dropped her purse on the counter, and muttered something about traffic before heading upstairs. I sat at the kitchen table, a half-drunk cup of coffee in front of me. The house was quiet, just the ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant hum of traffic outside. I flexed my fingers, the old scars across my knuckles stretching tight. I'd broken these hands more times than I could count, on perps, on doors, on the bones of men who thought they could do whatever they pleased without consequence. But this wasn't a problem I could solve with fists. Maggie had been different once. I remembered her as the sharp-eyed woman who wouldn't let me get away with anything, who could shut down a room with a look. Now she avoided my eyes, spoke in half-truths, spent too much time on her phone. I stood, drained the coffee, and grabbed my keys. Sitting here wasn't going to do a damn thing. I needed fresh air, something to keep my hands busy. The garage smelled like oil and old metal. The '69 Charger I'd been working on for the past year sat under a tarp, waiting. I lifted the cover, ran a hand along the fender. I used to come out here when I needed to think. Tonight, though, my thoughts weren't the kind I could just hammer out with a wrench. Instead, I pulled out my phone, dialed a number I hadn't used in a while. It rang twice before I got an answer. Ellis. The voice on the other end was as familiar as my own. Lincoln Iverson, ex-partner. We hadn't talked much since I walked off the force. He stayed. I didn't. That was the difference between us. You busy? I asked. He exhaled, and I heard the faint sound of a lighter flicking open. I was just about to pour myself a drink. You need something? Yeah. A favor. Silence stretched. I knew what he was thinking. I didn't ask for favors. Where you at? He finally said. Murphy's. I'll be there in 10. Murphy's was the kind of bar where no one asked questions, where men sat with their backs to the wall and watched the door like something might come through it at any minute. I took a booth in the back, ordered a whiskey, and let my eyes sweep the room. The usual crowd, construction workers, a couple of off-duty cops, a guy in a suit who looked like he'd made a wrong turn. Lincoln showed up exactly 10 minutes later, dropping into the seat across from me. He looked the same, square jaw, graying at the temples, suit jacket wrinkled like he'd been wearing it for too many hours. He gave me a long look. You look like hell. I ignored that. I need a name. Lincoln signaled the waitress, ordered a beer. Whose? I pulled a folded napkin from my pocket, smoothed it out on the table. I'd written it down earlier. The name Maggie had murmured in her sleep last night. The name she'd said with a softness I hadn't heard in years. Michael Thomas. Lincoln took one look and let out a low breath. Jesus. You sure? I nodded. He dragged a hand down his face. You know what you're asking me to do? I just need to know who he is. What he does. If he's clean. Lincoln snorted. Nobody's clean. I didn't argue. We both knew better. He leaned back, rolled his beer bottle between his palms. Thomas owns that garage over on Fulton. Works on bikes. Runs with a rough crowd, but nothing that's put him inside. He gave me a look. Yet, that was enough. For now. Lincoln hesitated. You want me to handle this? I shook my head. I'll take care of it. He sighed, rubbing his temple. You always do. I drained the last of my whiskey and set the glass down with a dull thud. Thanks for the drink. I left him sitting there and walked out into the cold. The city stretched in front of me, neon lights casting long shadows. I slid behind the wheel of my truck, fingers drumming against the steering wheel. I had a name. I had a location. Now it was just a matter of time. I didn't go home. Not yet. Instead, I drove. Kept my hands busy on the wheel, let the engine's low rumble fill the silence in my head. The garage Lincoln mentioned wasn't far, just past a row of old warehouses on Fulton. The kind of place where men worked late because they didn't have anywhere else to be. I killed the headlights before pulling in across the street. The place was open, big metal doors rolled up, fluorescent lights spilling onto the pavement. A couple of bikes lined up near the entrance, chrome catching the light. Inside, 3 guys leaned over a Harley, arguing about something. One of them had a cigarette hanging from his lips, gesturing with a wrench. And there he was, Michael Thomas. He had the look of a man who thought the rules didn't apply to him. Muscular, cocky, sleeves pushed up to show off forearms knotted with sinew and ink. He leaned against a workbench, nodding along to the conversation but not really listening. He didn't have to. Guys like him were used to being the center of gravity in a room. I sat there, watching, letting the anger settle into something useful. There was no point in kicking in the door and smashing his face in. That wasn't how you handle these things. No, the smart move was patience. Let him keep thinking he was in control. A knock on the driver's side window snapped me out of it. I didn't jump. Just turned my head slow, met a pair of wary eyes. A kid, maybe 17, hands stuffed in the pockets of a hoodie too big for him. I cracked the window. You lost. The kid shook his head. Nah. You're Donovan, right? I didn't answer. He shifted on his feet. Toby said you might need some help. Toby, one of the street kids I looked out for. Always had his ear to the ground. Always knew who was coming and going before they did. I opened the door, stepped out. The kid didn't back up, just watched me like he was deciding whether or not I was worth talking to. What's your name? I asked. Caleb. You work for Thomas? He snorted. Hell no. I clean up around here sometimes, that's it. He glanced over his shoulder toward the garage. I know what you're looking for. I raised an eyebrow. That right? Yeah. He wiped his nose on his sleeve. Ain't the first time he's been with someone else's wife. That didn't surprise me. Caleb shifted again, glancing at the shop. Look, man, I don't want trouble, but, just so you know, he don't care. Ain't scared of husbands. Hell, half the time, he brags about it. I felt the muscle in my jaw tighten. That's so? Yeah. He hesitated. And your wife? She ain't just another one. He likes her. That was good to know. I pulled a 20 from my wallet, handed it to him. If you hear anything else, you tell Toby. Caleb took the money but didn't look happy about it. You gonna kill him? I met his eyes. Not tonight. He nodded like that made sense, then turned and walked off. I stayed another 10 minutes, long enough to watch Thomas swagger through his shop, slap one of his guys on the shoulder, laugh at something I couldn't hear. Then I put the truck in gear and headed home. When I got there, the house was dark. Maggie was asleep. Or pretending to be. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom for a long time, watching the slow rise and fall of her breathing. Once, she would have woken up the second I walked in. No? Nothing. I walked into the bathroom, turned on the sink, let the cold water run over my hands. My knuckles still ached from old fights, old lessons. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, I woke before dawn, the way I always did. Years of training, years of knowing bad things happened when most people were still sleeping. I made coffee, black, no sugar, the way it had been since my academy days. Sat at the kitchen table, watching the light creep in through the blinds. The house was still. Maggie hadn't come downstairs yet. I didn't expect her to. I took my time, went through the motions of the morning shower, fresh clothes, laced up my boots. Routine kept a man steady. When I finally heard movement upstairs, I didn't look up. Just sipped my coffee, flipping through the paper like it mattered. Maggie came down quiet. No greeting, just the sound of cabinets opening and closing. She moved slower than usual, careful. Like she thought I'd say something, ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. I didn't. She poured herself a cup, leaned against the counter. You were out late. I turned a page. So were you. That got her attention. A little pause, barely noticeable. If I hadn't spent years reading people, I might have missed it. She recovered quick, brought the mug to her lips. I was with Emma. Emma. The one friend of hers I still respected. If Emma had been there, Maggie would have had an alibi. But I already knew Emma hadn't been there the whole time. I closed the paper, pushed back my chair. You seeing her again today? Maggie hesitated, then shook her head. I've got errands. I nodded, stood, rinsed my cup. I'll be late. She blinked, like she hadn't expected me to say anything at all. Late for what? Work. She frowned. You don't have a job, Donovan. I gave her a look. She knew what I did. Knew I spent my nights handling the problems the system couldn't. She didn't like it, but she never stopped me. Call me if you need anything, I said. She didn't. I left without another word. The city was waking up by the time I hit the streets. Delivery trucks, early commuters, store owners unlocking their doors. I drove without a destination, just letting my mind work through things. I had the facts, had the players. Now I just needed to push the right pieces. First stop was Toby. Found him exactly where I expected, leaning against the wall outside the old pawn shop on 12th, hoodie pulled up, tapping something on his phone. He looked up when I stepped out of the truck. Morning, old man, he said, stuffing his phone in his pocket. You don't usually swing by this early. I need eyes on Thomas. Toby gave a slow nod. Yeah, figured it was about him. You hear anything else? The kid grinned. I hear everything. I waited. Toby shrugged. He's getting cocky. Told a couple of his boys he's training a new rider. He smirked. That's what he's calling it, anyway. I exhaled through my nose, jaw tightening. Also, Toby continued. Word is, he's got some debt. Not to the bank, either. That was interesting. Who does he owe? Couple of bad types. Names I've heard before. Guys you wouldn't want to owe a dime, let alone whatever he's into them for. I filed that away. A man in debt made mistakes. And mistakes could be exploited. I slid Toby a couple of 20s. Keep listening. He took the cash, tucked it away. You got it. I left him there and headed toward the garage. This time, I wasn't watching from a distance. This time, I was walking in. Thomas was exactly where I figured he'd be, leaning against a workbench, talking to one of his guys. The man ran a hand through his hair, laughing at something, like he didn't have a care in the world. I stepped through the door, boots heavy on the concrete. The place smelled like grease and burnt rubber. Every head in the shop turned toward me, but I wasn't looking at them. Thomas saw me, pushed off the bench, a slow grin stretching across his face. Well, look at this. He spread his arms. Didn't expect a visit from the law. I'm not the law, I said. He laughed. Yeah, I know. You're the guy who walked away. Too righteous for the badge, right? He smirked. So what's this about? You need a tune-up? I didn't blink. I need you to stay away from my wife. The room went silent. One of the other mechanics took a step back, like he didn't want to be anywhere near what was about to happen. Thomas tilted his head, acting amused, but I saw the tension in his shoulders. That right? I took a step closer. Yeah, that's right. He let out a breathy chuckle, shaking his head. Come on, Ellis. You can't be serious. We're all grown-ups here. Your wife. I was on him before he finished the sentence. Grabbed him by the collar, yanked him in close. The laughter died in his throat. I could feel the pulse in his neck jump. Say it, I said, voice low. He swallowed. His hands twitched, like he wanted to push me off, but thought better of it. I tightened my grip. I came here to give you a chance to walk away. His jaw twitched. And if I don't? I leaned in, just enough so he could see the promise in my eyes. Then you'll find out exactly what kind of man I am. The moment stretched. His guys stood frozen, waiting to see how this was going to play out. Then, finally, Thomas forced a smirk. You always this dramatic? I let go, took a slow step back. No. I dusted off my jacket like he wasn't even worth the effort. This is me being polite. His smirk faltered. I turned and walked out. He had his warning. Now I'd see if he was smart enough to listen. I didn't look back as I walked to my truck, but I could feel their eyes on me. A room full of men waiting to see if their boss was stupid enough to make a move. Thomas didn't. Not then. I got in, started the engine, and pulled out slow. No rush. No need to show my hand. But the second I hit the main road, I let out a breath. That was step one. Now I'd see if he had the brains to take the out I'd given him. Something told me he wouldn't. By the time I got back to my side of town, the sun had burned through the morning chill. I stopped at Murphy's, same booth, same whiskey. I wasn't there for a drink. I was there for Lincoln. He showed up 20 minutes later, slid into the seat across from me, rubbing a hand over his face. You got people talking. I picked up my glass, took a slow sip. Yeah. He gave me a look. You walked into Thomas's shop and put hands on him. You know how that looks. Like a warning. Lincoln sighed, shaking his head. Christ, Donovan. He drummed his fingers against the table. What's your endgame here? You trying to scare him off? Just laying the groundwork. He exhaled through his nose, leaning back. You're playing a dangerous game. I met his eyes. It's not a game. Lincoln studied me, then nodded like he'd already known the answer. You know, there's a reason most men just take the divorce and walk. Most men don't have my patience. He huffed a laugh. That's one way to put it. He waved the waitress down, ordered a coffee. All right, I got something for you. I raised an eyebrow. Thomas's debt? It's not to your standard neighborhood loan shark. This is serious. He owes some real bastards, and from what I hear, the clock's running out. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket, slid it across the table. That's the guy holding the leash. You might recognize the name. I unfolded the page, scanned it, and smiled. I did recognize the name. Carlo Bennett. A relic from the old days. Ran a crew out of Jersey City, the kind of guy who didn't take IOUs. If Thomas owed him money, that meant he was desperate. Stupid. Which meant I had leverage. Lincoln saw the look on my face and shook his head. Jesus. I don't even want to know what's going through your head right now. You don't. I finished my drink, left a few bills on the table. but you'll hear about it soon enough. Lincoln muttered something under his breath, but he didn't stop me as I got up and walked out. I made a call before I even got in the truck. Toby picked up on the first ring. You got something? He asked. Yeah. Get me a meeting with Bennett. Toby whistled. Man, you really don't mess around. Never have. He was quiet for a second. All right. Give me an hour. That was fine. I had time. I drove, let my mind work through the next steps. This wasn't about just hurting Thomas. It wasn't about Maggie anymore either. This was about control. About reminding certain people how the world worked. An hour later, I was sitting in the back of a small Italian joint, waiting. Bennett showed up exactly on time, flanked by two men who looked like they didn't have a sense of humor. He was older now, but the eyes were the same. Cold, calculating. He slid into the seat across from me, smoothed a hand over his pressed jacket. Well, if it isn't Donovan Ellis, he said, voice easy, but the weight behind it was anything but. I'd ask how retirement is treating you, but somehow, I don't think you ever really quit. I let that sit. Took a sip of my water. I hear you've got a problem. Thought I might be able to help. His lips twitched. You don't strike me as the charitable type. I'm not. I set the paper Lincoln gave me on the table, tapped a finger against Thomas's name. I hear this guy owes you. Bennett exhaled through his nose, leaning back. More than he can pay. I nodded. What's he worth to you? He tilted his head. Depends. You looking to make him disappear? No. I leaned forward, held his gaze. I want him ruined. Not gone. Useless to you. Useless to anyone. Bennett studied me for a long moment, then smirked. You always were a creative bastard. I didn't respond. He tapped a ring finger against the table. All right. I'll give you a week. You want him done. Do it clean. No bodies, no heat. If you screw it up, I'll clean up my own mess. That was fair. I nodded. Bennett stood, buttoned his jacket. I like you, Ellis. Always have. But don't mistake that for trust. I wouldn't dream of it. He left without another word. I sat there a moment, finishing my drink. Then I stood, stretched my shoulders, and headed back into the night. It was time to set the trap. The first crack in Thomas's world came 3 days later. I'd kept my distance, let things play out, but I wasn't sitting idle. Toby kept an eye on him, feeding me details. Late nights at the shop, hushed conversations with men who didn't belong in the world of wrenches and oil changes. The kind of men who collected debts with interest. He was sweating, and I wanted him to. Then the real move came. A city inspector showed up at his shop, clipboard in hand, a couple of uniformed guys behind him. A random inspection, checking permits, code violations. It didn't take long before they started shutting things down. Too many violations. Too many unpaid fines. The doors were locked before noon. Thomas showed up just as they were posting the closure notice. He argued, loud and desperate, but paperwork didn't care about pride. He kicked a trash can across the lot, paced like a caged animal. He was losing control, and I wanted him to feel it. By the time I got to Murphy's that evening, Lincoln was already there, nursing a beer, watching me like he knew exactly what I'd been up to. You really got away with people, you know that? He muttered as I slid into the booth. I signaled the waitress, ordered a whiskey. Something on your mind? Yeah, you. He drummed his fingers on the table. You gonna tell me how that inspector found his way to Thomas's doorstep? I took a sip, let the burn settle. Just lucky, I guess. Lincoln let out a dry laugh. Right. And I'm the goddamn Pope. He shook his head. He's pissed, Donovan. You think he's just gonna roll over? I don't need him to roll over. I need him to break. Lincoln exhaled, sat back. You got something bigger lined up, don't you? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Lincoln rubbed his face. All right. Just tell me one thing. I waited. You got a line you won't cross? That was a good question. Once, I'd had rules. Once, I'd worn a badge and believed in limits. But I learned a long time ago that justice didn't come from policies and procedures. It came from men who were willing to see things through. I tossed back the rest of my drink and stood. Good seeing you, Lincoln. I left him sitting there, shaking his head. The next step was already in motion. It started with Maggie. I made sure she heard things. Casual comments, little slips of information that I let trickle through Emma, through the right channels. A mention of Thomas's financial problems. A hint that he was in trouble, that he was desperate. I knew Maggie, knew how she thought. The moment she saw a crack in the fantasy, she'd start pulling away. She wanted the thrill, not the consequences. And I was right. 2 nights later, she was home early, quiet, distant. She wasn't getting messages every 5 minutes anymore. She wasn't sneaking glances at her phone. She was already untangling herself, trying to find an escape before things got ugly. That was good. That meant she'd be out of the way when the real hammer dropped. And it dropped hard. The following morning, Thomas's shop wasn't just closed, it was emptied. Locks changed. Bank notices on the door. Turns out, when you owe the wrong people money, and then the city shuts you down, things unravel fast. By noon, he was at a bar on the east side, drinking like a man with no moves left. That's where I found him. I walked in, spotted him at the counter, hunched over a glass, jaw tight, tension in every muscle. I pulled up a stool, sat down like I belonged there. He turned, blinked, then let out a slow, humorless laugh. Well, if it isn't the boogeyman. Rough day? I asked. His fingers flexed around the glass. You enjoying this? I shrugged. I warned you. He stared at me, eyes dark, full of something sharp and ugly. You did this. I met his gaze. Didn't flinch. No, Michael. You did this. Silence stretched. He looked away first, jaw clenched. You think this makes you better than me? I let out a breath, leaned in slightly. No. But it makes me the one who's still standing. He exhaled, picked up his drink, and tossed it back. I stood, dropped the 20 on the bar. You should pack up. Get out of town while you still can. He didn't say anything. I walked out, left him there to drown in the mess he'd made. It wasn't over yet. Not completely. But it was close. I gave Thomas his chance. Gave him the out. Told him to leave town and cut his losses. He didn't take it. Instead, he doubled down. That night, Toby called. You're not gonna like this, he said, voice low. Thomas is not running. He's pissed. Talking big. Big how? Like he's gonna take back what's his. Like he's got something up his sleeve. I sat back in my chair, rolling my cigarette between my fingers. He's got nothing left. Yeah, well, he doesn't see it that way. Word is, he's blaming you for everything. Shop, money, your wife pulling away. I exhaled, long and slow. Where is he? Some dive on the south side. Drinking like it's his last night on earth. I pinched the bridge of my nose. Who's with him? Toby hesitated. A couple of guys I don't recognize. Not his usual crew. That got my attention. If Thomas was bringing in outsiders, that meant one thing. He wasn't looking for a fair fight. I killed the call and grabbed my jacket. The bar was one of those places where people want to be forgotten. Dim lights, sticky floors, the kind of joint that had never seen a health inspector. I walked in slow, took my time adjusting to the dark. The place smelled like stale beer and bad decisions. I spotted Thomas in the back. He wasn't alone. Two guys sat with him, rough-looking, the kind of muscle that didn't come cheap. Thomas himself was half-drunk, his knuckles raw like he'd put them through something that didn't give. I walked straight to the bar, took a seat where I could watch him in the mirror. The bartender, a grizzled old guy who'd seen more fights than he'd broken up, eyed me. Whiskey. Water. He huffed a laugh but poured it. I didn't have to wait long. Thomas noticed me. Sat up straighter. Said something to his new friends before pushing away from the table. He walked over slow, like he was giving me time to think better of it. I didn't move. He stopped at my side, leaned in slightly. You got a death wish, Ellis? I picked up my glass, took a sip. Not tonight. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You just couldn't leave it alone, could you? I set the glass down. Neither could you. His lip curled. You think you won? I finally turned to face him, met his eyes head on. I think you lost. Something snapped in him then. He grabbed my shoulder, hard, but I barely felt it. I'd been hit harder by better men. You think this is over? He hissed. I let the silence stretch, let him feel the weight of it. Then I leaned in, voice just as low. I know it is. Thomas let go like he'd been burned, his breathing uneven. Go home, Michael, I said, voice steady. Or don't. Either way, this is done. He stood there a second longer, fists clenching and unclenching. Then he turned on his heel and stormed out, his hired muscle trailing behind. I watched him go, then turned back to my drink. The bartender whistled under his breath. Thought that was going to go a different way. I smirked. So did he. I finished my water, left cash on the counter, and walked out. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew a beaten man when I saw one. Thomas wouldn't come back from this. And if he did, I'd be ready. 2 weeks passed. No word from Thomas. No sightings. No threats. It was like he'd vanished. Toby confirmed it first. He's gone, he said over the phone. Cleaned out his place. No one's seen him since that night at the bar. I nodded to myself. That was how it ended for guys like him. Not in a blaze of glory. Not with fist and blood. Just a quiet, pathetic exit when they realized the game was over. Maggie was still in the house, moving like a ghost through rooms that didn't feel like hers anymore. She knew I wasn't staying. She didn't ask where I was going, didn't ask to talk about it. That ship had sailed. One night, she stopped me in the hallway, voice soft. Donovan. I turned, waited. Her eyes flickered with something, regret, maybe, or just the weight of it all settling in. Are you ever going to forgive me? I let the silence sit between us, let her feel it. Then I shook my head. No. Her throat worked like she wanted to say something else, but she didn't. She just nodded once, like she already knew the answer. The next morning, I was gone before the sun came up. Emma met me at Murphy's before I left town. She had that cautious look, like she wasn't sure if she wanted to say what was on her mind. You gonna disappear for good? She asked. I smirked. I'm not the disappearing type. She exhaled, shaking her head. Hell of a thing you pulled, Donovan. I didn't answer. She reached into her bag, pulled out a folded piece of paper, set it on the table. She wrote you this. I didn't touch it. Just stared at it like it was a bomb waiting to go off. Emma sighed. Look, I don't know what you're looking for out there. But I know one thing, this town is a little less rotten because of you. I picked up the paper, slid it into my jacket without opening it. That was the point. She smirked. Yeah, guess it was. I left her there, same as I'd left everything else behind. The Charger rumbled under me as I hit the road, the city shrinking in the rear view. I didn't have a destination. Didn't need one. Some men live for redemption. Some live for revenge. Me? I just keep moving.